Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Hey, Chris, I am genuinely fired up about today's topic because it sits at this perfect three-way intersection of AI policy, employment law, and total regulatory chaos in Brussels right now.
So set the stage for our listeners because something really wild happened on Tuesday night that almost no one outside European policy circles is actually talking about today, and the implications are massive.
Right? So on Tuesday, April 28th, EU lawmakers walked into a Trilogue meeting expecting to finalize the AI Act Omnibus, which was basically a regulatory mulligan, and 12 hours later, they walked out empty-handed with no deal, no compromise, and no path forward before the next session.
Okay, regulatory mulligan is a phrase I never expected to hear before noon, but I love it. Walk us through what the Omnibus was actually supposed to do, because most of our listeners have probably never even heard the word.
So the AI Act passed back in 2024, and it has this staggered timeline of obligations that kick in over several years, with the really big hammer falling on August 2nd of 2026 for high-risk systems, which is roughly 3 months from today.
And industry has been pushing back hard, saying the timelines are too tight, the technical standards are not finalized, and companies cannot possibly comply by that summer deadline, that enormous risk of accidental non-compliance and the eye-watering fines that come with it.
Exactly. So the European Commission proposed the Omnibus package back in November, which would have pushed the high-risk Annex 3 deadline out to December 2nd of 2027 and the Annex 1 product deadline all the way out to August 2nd of 2028.
That's basically a 16-month delay for the most consequential piece of the entire regulation, which would have given enterprises a legitimate runway to get their compliance houses in order without having to hit panic mode in the next 90 days.
And it would have given the standards bodies more time to actually publish the harmonized standards that companies need to demonstrate conformity, because right now, half of those standards are still in draft form and not yet usable for legal certification purposes.
So what was the sticking point? 12 hours of negotiation and they could not get to a yes? That is a lot of espresso for a meeting that ends in a stalemate, especially given how high the stakes were for both sides of the table.
The collapse came down to one specific disagreement about Annex 1 conformity assessment, which is the part of the Act that handles AI baked into regulated physical products like industrial machinery, medical devices, and in vitro diagnostic platforms used in hospital labs.
Regulated physical products, meaning things like industrial machinery, medical devices, in vitro diagnostics. The categories that already have their own thick rulebooks for safety certification under existing EU sectoral laws that have been on the books for decades.
Exactly right. Think of an MRI scanner with an AI-assisted diagnostic module, or a smart factory robot, or one of those genomic sequencing platforms that uses AI to interpret raw read data and produce clinical recommendations to doctors.
And those products already have to clear approvals under the machinery regulation, the medical device regulation, and the IVDR. So adding AI Act conformity assessment on top sounds like double jeopardy for manufacturers who have already invested years in existing certification.
Yes, and the Council wanted these Section A products to keep dual conformity assessment, while Parliament wanted them shifted into Section B for primarily sectoral handling, and neither side blinked across 12 hours of negotiation, which is honestly remarkable in Brussels politics.
That sounds technical, but the stakes are enormous. We're talking about whether a hospital procurement officer needs one approval document or two for every AI-enabled device they buy, and that delta translates directly into months of delay and millions of euros in cost.
And remember, that one disagreement was sufficient to block the entire omnibus, because Trilogue negotiations work as an all-or-nothing political package, not a piecemeal vote where you can ratify the agreed parts and keep arguing about the contested ones.
So now what happens to the August 2nd of 2026 deadline that the Omnibus was supposed to push back? Does it just snap back into force automatically, or is there some grace period that everyone has been quietly assuming would materialize?
Legally, yes. The original AI Act timeline never went away. It was just provisionally suspended in spirit while the Omnibus was negotiated, and now that the deal collapsed, the original deadline reasserts itself with full force and zero grace period built in.
Which means anyone deploying a high-risk AI system in the EU has roughly 3 months to be fully compliant with Annex 3 obligations. And that is genuinely terrifying for the procurement and compliance teams trying to scramble through that checklist right now.
And let's talk about what Annex 3 actually covers, because this is where it gets really interesting for our listeners who work outside heavy industry. since the scope of what counts as high risk is broader than most executives currently realize.
Yeah, when most people hear AI regulation, they think of frontier models or autonomous vehicles, but Annex 3 is much more pedestrian and much more universal than that, touching every company that uses any AI in a hiring or employment decision context.
Annex 3 covers AI used in recruitment, applicant screening, performance evaluation, promotion decisions, and even termination recommendations, which means basically every HR tech vendor in the world is on the hook, plus every customer who deploys those tools internally inside their workforce.
So if you're using an AI tool to screen resumes or rank candidates, or score interview transcripts, or flag underperformers in a performance review cycle, that system is now classified as high risk under Annex 3, regardless of how lightweight you thought it was.
And high risk doesn't just mean fill out a form, it means risk management systems, data governance, logging, transparency, human oversight, accuracy testing, robustness, cybersecurity, and a CE marking before deployment, which is roughly the certification load of a medical device.
That is a massive checklist, especially when you consider how many companies have just quietly bolted ChatGPT or some agentic co-pilot into their hiring workflow over the last 18 months without ever flagging it through their legal or compliance review process.
And because the EU AI Act is extraterritorial, this applies to any company anywhere in the world if they're using AI to evaluate EU-based candidates or employees, which captures basically every multinational with even a single European hire on the books.
Wait, so a recruiter in San Francisco using a US-built AI screening tool to evaluate a candidate sitting in Berlin is now covered by all of these obligations, even if the company has no European entity and no European customers whatsoever?
That is exactly right, and the fines are not symbolic. We're talking about up to 35 million euros or 7% of global annual turnover, whichever is higher, which is the same penalty regime as GDPR, but with arguably broader scope.
7% of global revenue is the kind of number that gets very serious attention from a board of directors, even if you've never sold a single product into Europe, because that fine could literally bankrupt smaller companies in a single enforcement action.
And the rub is that most of the companies actually exposed here are not the big AI labs in California. They are SaaS vendors, HR tech platforms, and the customers using their tools, often without any awareness that they are now in regulatory scope.
Companies like Workday, Eightfold, HireVue, Greenhouse, Beamery, plus all of the agentic startups that have been embedding LLM-driven candidate evaluation into their pipelines over the last 2 years, are suddenly looking at a serious certification obligation.
Right, and many of those vendors have been telling customers, do not worry, we'll be ready when the deadline arrives, with the underlying assumption that the deadline would slip, which now looks like a much shakier bet after Tuesday night in Brussels.
That's a dangerous assumption. The omnibus collapse is a real shot across the bow for anyone who is banking on a delay to buy more compliance runway, and the smart procurement teams are already starting to call their vendors for documentation right now.
Now the next Trilogue is scheduled for around May 13th of 2026 under the Cypriot presidency. So there is still a window for a rescue, but it is a genuinely narrow window given how far apart the two sides remain on the core issue.
2 weeks to bridge a 12-hour stalemate seems optimistic, especially because the underlying disagreement about Annex 1 conformity assessment is genuinely about how member states want to allocate regulatory authority, which is a deeply political question rather than a technical one.
And that is not a technical fix. That's a political philosophy fight. With Parliament wanting more centralized AI-specific governance and Council wanting member state sectoral regulators to keep their turf, and those positions are not easy to bridge in 2 weeks.
So even if a deal lands on May 13th, the language has to be drafted, voted, published in the official journal, and then companies have whatever runway is left, which at this point might be only a few weeks before the original deadline strikes anyway.
Which is why most large enterprises are now operating on a dual-track strategy, planning for August 2nd of 2026 compliance while privately hoping the politicians eventually pull off a delay, and that dual track is enormously expensive to execute well.
That sounds expensive because building real compliance machinery is not something you can swap on and off depending on the political winds in a 27-story conference room in Brussels, especially when notified body assessments take months of lead time.
Exactly. And we're already seeing the rise of a whole new vendor ecosystem around AI Act compliance. Things like AI registries, model cards as a service, conformity assessment platforms, and specialty consultancies that did not even exist 3 years ago.
Companies like Modulos, Holistic AI, Credo AI, and a bunch of others are building what is essentially the GRC stack for AI systems. And they are absolutely loving this uncertainty because every collapsed Trilogue is a sales accelerator for their core platform.
And the big four consultancies are obviously circling because every CIO and every general counsel is now scrambling to figure out which of their internal AI deployments suddenly count as Annex 3 high risk, and the billable hours on those engagements are eye-popping.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second, because I want to be fair to the regulators here. What is the Steelman case for not delaying the deadline, given the obvious pain it creates for industry across the board right now?
The steelman is that AI hiring tools are already making real decisions about real people's livelihoods, often with measurable bias, and every month of delay is another month of unaccountable algorithmic harm to candidates who never even know they were screened out.
That's a serious moral argument, especially when you look at studies showing AI, screening tools, systematically underrating candidates from certain demographic groups. And that pattern is documented across multiple peer-reviewed research papers from the last 3 years of academic work.
And there's a precedent question. If the EU pushes its first major AI deadline back at the first sign of industry pressure, it sets a tone for every future obligation in the Act, which would be a real strategic loss for the Commission's enforcement posture.
So Brussels is in a tough spot. Push the deadline and you look weak. Hold the deadline and you trigger a compliance scramble that might actually slow EU AI adoption and reinforce the narrative that Europe is hostile territory for AI innovation, broadly speaking.
Which is exactly why the political class would love a clean technical delay that doesn't look like capitulation. And that is what the Omnibus was supposed to be. A face-saving package wrapped in technical adjustments that nobody could really call a retreat.
A legislative way to swap out the engine on a moving car without admitting that the original deadline was unrealistic in the first place. Politically very tidy, technically very fragile, and now we see exactly how fragile that compromise actually was in practice.
And the collapse on Tuesday shows just how fragile the consensus actually was, because it only takes one disagreement on one annex to blow up the whole package, and there are still several other contested files lurking in the broader omnibus discussion.
So what should our listeners actually do right now? Forget the politics for a second and think about practical action items for the next 90 days. Because hope is not a compliance strategy, and the calendar does not care about Brussels drama.
Step 1. Inventory every AI system touching EU-based employees or candidates, including the third-party vendors you have integrated, because you cannot comply with what you have not cataloged, and most companies have a much bigger AI footprint than they realize.
Step 2. Classify each system against Annex 3 so you actually know which ones are high risk and which fall under lighter obligations like transparency only. And document your classification rationale, because regulators will absolutely ask you to defend those decisions later.
Step 3. Demand documentation from your vendors right now, because under the Act, you as the deployer are partly on the hook even when the system is built by someone else, and getting that paperwork chain in order takes weeks, not days.
That last point is huge. The Act splits responsibilities between providers, who build, and deployers, who use. And a lot of companies are deployers without realizing what that obligation looks like, and the line between provider and deployer can be surprisingly fuzzy.
And remember, even if the May 13th Trilogue succeeds and pushes the deadline, your inventory and classification work is not wasted, because those obligations are coming either way, and getting ahead of them puts you in a much stronger negotiating position with vendors.
Right, the omnibus delays the obligations, it does not eliminate them. So anyone treating this as a free pass is going to be in for a rude awakening down the road when the real audits start showing up at their door.
Last thought from me, watch the standards bodies. CN, Senelec, and ETSI publishing the harmonized standards is what actually unlocks practical compliance. And that schedule is independent of the political timeline and ultimately determines what real-world compliance looks like for everyone.
Which means even if the politicians give companies more runway, the technical standards still need to be finalized before most enterprises can confidently demonstrate conformity to a notified body. And that drafting process has its own bottlenecks separate from the Trilogue chaos.
So the real story is that AI regulation in Europe just got messier, more uncertain, and more expensive. And Brussels is going to have to do something dramatic in the next 2 weeks if they want to avoid a genuinely chaotic compliance scramble.
Or accept that the August 2nd of 2026 deadline holds. And a whole lot of HR tech vendors are about to learn what high-risk classification really feels like in practice, with regulators who are absolutely ready to make an example of someone.
It's going to be a fascinating 2 weeks of European policy theater, and we'll absolutely come back to this story when the May 13th Trilogue actually happens, because the outcome of that meeting will shape AI compliance across the entire continent for years.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.